Namah Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prastaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swamin Ite Namani.
So what had happened was there were a lot of prospective initiates waiting there, and so Mukunda and Giriraj, I believe, arranged for one or two to go and stay with Prabhupada in his house for 1 or 2 days. So that was a wonderful experience for me because my initiation was in Prabhupada's house. It was a one-on-one, you see. So when it was my time to go, I was told to bring something which is called dakshin. I brought him some sandalwood oil, some cloth, and some incense. And I was very, very timid and very shy in those days, and very anxious and very nervous. So I went up there with all these things, and I knocked on the door. Kirtananda was with Prabhupada and Hayagriva, and I believe Upendra, but I'm not quite sure if he was there. And I was very anxious to go in and see the Swami, and they had to calm me down and say, just a minute, the Swami will see in a little while. This is like this, very nervous. And so I sat there, and after a while, Swamiji, as we called him, called us in, Srila Prabhupada, called me in. And I didn't know how to act, what to do, what to bow down, how long to stay. And I offered him my respects. And he said to me, I remember the first thing he said was, oh, so you want to be initiated? And right away I was feeling condescending in my mind. Well, of course I do. Why else am I here, you see? I took a little offense by that, due to arrogance, false pride. But it dissipated very easily. And I said yes, and he asked me if I knew what the requirements were, and I told him the rules and regulations. And the thing that I noticed about Prabhupada was I was very attracted to his eyes. There was something very special. At that time, that's all I can understand. They were just glowing, and it was something about him that was very different. It really soothed me. So he said, all right, you can go now, and we'll call you back in a little while. I offered my obeisances, and I just stayed down. I didn't know how long to stay there. So I just stayed down there, and Prabhupada said, all right, you can get up now. And so I got up, and then I went out. And I don't recall exactly what I was doing, but we were sitting outside for a while. A little while later, I think it was Kirtananda called me, and he nudged me. He said, come in, the Swami wants to see you. So he called me in. Prabhupada was sitting on his bed. I sat on the floor. It was a very narrow room, maybe 4 or 5 feet wide and 8 or 9 long, approximately. I remember there was a picture that Jagadatri had painted of, or somebody, Jagadatri, at one side of the bed, and one on this side of Prabhupada. I don't recall. It might have been his Gurudev, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. And he told me the basic rules and regulations, checked with me again if I knew them, and I told him. And then he chanted on my beads. And there was no fire sacrifice for my first initiation. And then he said, my name is Aniruddha. I remember that's how Prabhupada said it. I remember that Dha. And I said, what does it mean? He said, it's the grandson of Krishna. I couldn't think of anything to say. I was very fidgety. So then he said, do you have any questions? And I was foolish. I couldn't think of anything intelligent to say. And I remember reading that one of the qualities of a devotee is that he's grave. So I said, what does grave mean? It's just a silly question. Prabhupada looked at me, but he just smiled and he told me what it meant, And then I left his association. Again, I offered my obeisances and went out.
Then I don't remember if he asked me if there was anything I wanted to ask him or if I just blurted it out. But I do remember that it was just like the enormity of the implication of what I was doing. It was beginning to dawn on me. And I just blurted out, Srila Prabhupada, how am I going to remember you and surrender to you for the rest of my life? I figured, wow, how am I going to do this? And he was quiet for a second, but he actually liked that a lot. He liked that question. And he chuckled a little, and then he said, if you just chant your 16 rounds a day and follow the 4 principles, you'll remember me and you'll surrender to me. And then he paused for a moment, and then he laughed again, and he said, "Don't forget to feed me." So I was, later on, in later years, I was thinking, Prabhupada's so kind because he knows what a simpleton I am. I'm so simple that this is all I have to do. And he's telling me, I'll go back home to Godhead, because if you remember Prabhupada and surrender to him, wherever he goes, you're going to go. And he's definitely in the spiritual world. So that's my task, is to try and do that properly. And I've been told also that he meant by "don't forget to feed me," distribute his books, preach. But I think he meant don't forget to offer food to him, so I don't take anything that isn't prasadam.
Well, I really developed kind of personal contact with Prabhupada when the temple left the La Cienega place, which was rented, and that time they purchased the place on Watsika. And it was Gargamuni and Dayananda, the old Dayananda, who were working closely with Prabhupada in the negotiations with I think it was the Methodist Church group. And I was just doing service, going out on Sankirtan. And then Gargamuni said, well, we need somebody to build the temple, to redecorate. And somehow I got volunteered, or I don't know exactly how I got involved. I didn't have any real strong background in construction or anything. And I remember Gargamuni said, okay, well, you're going to be the person, and Prabhupada has a plan. So I went up to Prabhupada's room, and he made a little diagram of how he wanted the 3 doors. This was when the temple was in the other, not in the big sanctuary where it is now, but in that other hall that was in the back. And I started doing that construction. That was my full-time job. Everybody else was going on Sankirtan or whatever, and I was just involved in that. And Prabhupada would frequently come down and take a look and say, oh yes, and let's do this, and let's do that. And then I would be called up to his room to give a progress report, or he would make some comments. So that was when in that activity, I spent a lot of time, or relatively a lot of time with Prabhupada, always on practical matters, Should this be tile? Should this be, what color should this be? Things like that. So that's when I kind of, I guess you'd say we became, there was, he knew who I was directly, and there was a lot of, relatively, a lot of association. And then when Gargamuni, I don't remember all the details. There was the thing about Brahmananda and Gargamuni and all the. I was out of the political circle. I didn't know what was going on in the politics of the leadership, the devotee leadership. But all of a sudden, it was announced that Gargamuni and Brahmananda and Tamal Krishna and Vishnu Janan were all going to take sannyas and go to India. And the presidency of the Los Angeles temple just kind of fell on me by default. And I think only because I was prominent in the sense of I'd done a lot of practical work. I don't remember showing any distinction doctrinally or philosophically or anywhere like that. In fact, I'd spent the previous several months all by myself just doing the work in the temple. But somehow or other it fell on me. And shortly thereafter, it was after that that Prabhupada decided to organize the GBC and the BBT. And I was, by virtue of the fact that I was at that point the president of the LA temple, which was one of the bigger temples, and Prabhupada was spending more time there than just about any other place, because I think he found it conducive. He had an apartment of his own, and he was able to work on his books. And then I got drafted into those positions also. It all came about very quickly, and it was rather dramatic for me. I didn't really know exactly what was going on, or if I was qualified or could handle any of it, but that's how all that developed.
A little while later, Prabhupada was calling me, but I had already forgotten my name. He was calling Aniruddha, but I didn't know who he was calling, so I was just sitting there. And there was probably Kirtanand who came nudging me saying, the Swami is calling you, the Swami is calling you. So I went in, but I don't recall exactly what he said, you know, at the time. I've heard this from a lot of my god brothers and sisters. We're so nervous and don't know how to act. We don't always remember the specifics, you know. But the overall impression was overwhelming. You know, later on, it had such a great effect upon me, even just a short time later. But initially, I was bewildered. What I did remember, I spent 1 night and 2 days with Srila Prabhupada, is that the fact that his life was so perfectly organized, everything was at a certain time, you know. He had his time for waking up, time for japa, time for bath, time for massage, time for the meal, a time to take prasadam. We took a walk at a certain time. This was so impressive to me. My life had been so disorganized for so many years, and I really was very attracted to that.
And they used to bring Prabhupada in to give these silent darshans when he was sick, in his last days. And during that time, I felt he was training us for being able to communicate with him after he left the planet, because he would just come and they would place him under the tamal tree, and then the little Gurukula boy would play his cartels and they would dance for him, and one boy would just do the kirtan for Prabhupada. So we were always, of course, fighting to sit in the seats right in front of Srila Prabhupada when they would bring him in, and they would take him in front of Gaur Nitai and then Krishna Balaram and then Radha Sundar, and then bring his rocking chair down in front of the tamal tree. And then we would all sort of vie for a place to sit in front of Prabhupada and just sit there. And then this little kirtan would go on, and the 2 or 3 Gurukula boys would dance for Prabhupada, and he would at most nod his head. And so it was one of those days, and usually I was sort of in the back because I was one of the newest devotees, and so I always felt I didn't really have a right to push forward too much. But one day I was right in front of him, you know, and I was going to get a seat right in front of Srila Prabhupada. I couldn't believe how lucky I was. And it was sort of like everybody sort of pushing and shoving to get a place, you know. And so we went to sit down, and there was a little girl here who was a daughter of one of the devotees, and she was actually retarded. And later she left her body here and took an overdose. She took malaria medicine that was laying around her parents' room, and she left her body. And but she was there, and she was somehow going to sit down in the same seat where I was sitting, or where we were all sitting. And the girl next to me, the devotee next to me, took the little girl and sort of pushed her out of the way. And I looked at her and I thought, oh, she shouldn't have done that. Oh, she shouldn't have pushed that little child. But I sort of sat down and I looked up, and Prabhupada was staring right at us. And I thought, yeah, but Prabhupada, I didn't do it. I didn't do it, she did it, I didn't push the child. But he was staring just as intently at me as he was at the girl who had pushed the child. And I realized that I was just as responsible because I had done nothing about it. I had done nothing to placate the child or find the child a seat. My heart had not shown the compassion that it should have in that particular situation. So I've been working on that ever since, trying to develop that quality of, because simultaneously we have to be humble, but we also have to be compassionate toward everyone. So that was a rather direct lesson for me.
I know I walked with Srila Prabhupada on the ocean in the morning, and we had kirtan. It was a little fast, and Prabhupada said a little slower. And then I was going back on the bus, and I was trying to think, well, I don't feel any different, you know. I'm still thinking that a spiritual master is something like magic, or you have to get some charge or something, you know. And I was riding thinking, well, you know, I expected to feel something different, and I didn't. But as we were approaching the city, I felt such a surge of enthusiasm to be very serious, you know, that I wanted to be very strict with myself. I wanted to remain celibate, and I wanted to be brahmachari, and all the things Prabhupada was talking about, you know. And so I came back to the temple with this mood of enthusiasm, and they told me, you'll get over it. Because the San Francisco temple in those days was considered very, very loose compared to New York, which was very, very strict. You know, San Francisco was a different mood, and they were all wearing flowery clothes, and there wasn't such a strict following there. After some of the kirtans, the devotees would go off to the local coffee shop and have donuts and so forth, you know. So, but I was very attracted to what Prabhupada said. I wanted to be very serious in those days.
From the very first time that Prabhupada gave me that little drawing of how he envisioned the front part of the temple there in LA, I would say 95% of my contact and association with Prabhupada always had to do with specific practical matters. Dealing with Dynapan, the printer, managing the funds, the book trust funds, the Mayapur Vrindavan trust funds. It was all had to do with that. I mean, I would ask certain questions on behalf of, to answer greater issues, you know, if there was a dilemma about a philosophical point sometimes, but mainly my contact had to do with practical management affairs. Yeah. Only on the walks, when Prabhupada was in LA and was taking his morning walks on Venice Beach, there were always, it was the time for like philosophical debates, and I kind of, somehow I got worked into the position of the protagonist for the impersonalists and the scientists. And
Coming from that background.
yeah, and I have to say that I would always kind of qualify my questions or my arguments by saying this philosopher said this person said that, but I have to admit that I was expounding my own ideas and doubts. Prabhupada knew it too, I'm sure he perceived it. I wasn't just an exercise in academic objectivity. But in those moments, those times, it was kind of philosophical. But other than that, it was pretty practical. Yeah.
I didn't know what type of show it was, so I mentioned to the producer that we had an album called The Happening Album. I gave him prospectus, and so they saw that. The interviewer, the first thing he said to Srila Prabhupada was, "Oh, Swami, I understand you have a record album. You must make a lot of money." And Prabhupada just smiled at him and said, "Yes, $1,000 a week." You know, so he was defeated immediately because he was trying to get an audience. There was several popular shows at that time. He thought this was just some strange cult or something or other. He could cut him apart. So the interview in the end went along like that, but afterwards the producer couldn't look us in the face because he saw how genuine Srila Prabhupada was, you see. And then, but the Les Crane show was wonderful. There, we get in there, and the beginning of the show was Prabhupada chanting Bandeham prayers. It went on, they allowed it to go on for a longer period than they planned, and then he chanted Hare Krishna, and they had beautiful visuals of him and so forth, and devotees. And then they interviewed him, asking him the general questions about sadhana and so forth and so on. Prabhupada made the audience his friend right away. He was a real gentleman. He spoke very kindly, and he smiled, and he said, "And I am such and such of age, and I even have my original teeth." So the audience loved him right away, you see, because they thought they were going to get this heavy thing, you know. But he let Mukunda do a lot of the speaking, because Mukunda was a cool, calm and cool-headed boy, and he made a good impression, you know, and he spoke the basic things about tilak and so forth and so on. And then the latter part of the show, they had this Youth for Christ group on, and they were very dogmatic, you know. Christ is the only way, and so forth and so on, you know. And so the audience didn't like them very much, actually. And even after the show, they were very much taken with Srila Prabhupada. In the parking lot, they came over to him and saw that he was a genuine person. This is the quality, you know, that Prabhupada had. He was not like any of those other bogus gurus. Prabhupada said that before I have come to the Western world, all these other yogis have been just speculating on the mental platform, you see. So certainly, and he was just a perfect Vaishnava, gentleman, so he never disturbed anybody.
I remember one time in Mayapur, I was helping Daiva Shakti make the fruit for Srila Prabhupada in the morning, and Shrutakirti was his servant, and he said, Srila Prabhupada said that you should taste the watermelon before you put it on the plate to make sure it's okay. And so, you know, he told us that, and I thought, I can't taste the watermelon before I put it on Srila Prabhupada's plate. I just can't. I'll just get the one that looks the best and put it on his plate. And of course, it was no good. And the next day I heard, you know, you didn't taste the watermelon and it was no good, and Srila Prabhupada was very displeased. So he does reciprocate. My realization about Srila Prabhupada is that he reciprocates through others. That's the way he's done it for me, because I've never had the association that other older devotees have had. But somehow or another, his mercy is always there.
Then we had these college engagements. The UCLA was a fiasco. Nobody showed up. And Prabhupada gets to this place that I had arranged, due to my inexperience. I didn't do it very properly, and we didn't have much Lakshmi to advertise. And so nobody is there. So Prabhupada looks at me and he says, "So, Aniruddha?" And I just was being very shy. I just felt like I was about this size, you know. I wanted to hide somewhere. And he said, "That is all right. Let us have kirtan." So we had kirtan, and then some Indian student saw that there was some kind of sadhu inside, and he came in to speak with Srila Prabhupada. And they were speaking in their local language, probably Bengali or whatever. And you could see he was a bit challenging, like you know, a smart, like the Brahmanas who are impersonalists and so forth, intelligence and so forth. And there was a tone of argument there anyway. But when he spoke English, Srila Prabhupada said, "Tell me, young man, where are your Indian countrymen?" You see, and the young man was quite flustered. He didn't have an answer for that. And Prabhupada said very, very gravely, "I will tell you, they are lost." Hare Krishna.
One time we were I didn't go on many morning walks with Srila Prabhupada because I was a rank and filer. Mostly I used to watch the sannyasis and GBC men piling into the cars and going off, but sometimes I went. And one time I said to Srila Prabhupada as he was walking on Venice Beach, that Srila Prabhupada, everyone says that since you've come, the deities are looking even more beautiful. Prabhupada said, "That is my anxiety." So I didn't know how to process that. I just stayed silent. Prabhupada didn't say anything more. Then Prabhupada said, "That is my anxiety, that after I leave, you will neglect the deity worship, and then everything will be spoiled."
We bought our incense at the Vedanta Society, which was at that time, their property was on where Hollywood and Vine intersect. You take Vine going up to the bottom of the hills, and they had an ashram about a quarter of the way up there. And it was a private place, nice property. And I go there to buy incense because they had the best incense at that time. And I mentioned that to Prabhupada. He said, "I want to go and see that place." So I took him there, and he walked around the property, and he didn't really, you know, he was very aloof from the whole thing. And then he said, "I would like to have an appointment with the Swami in charge here." Swami, his name was Swami Prabhavananda. He, along with Christopher Isherwood, had written the Penguin edition of the Bhagavad Gita that many of us had been reading in those times. You know, it was just verses with some, you know, interpretation. And he was the head of this chapter of the Vedanta Society, which was of the Ramakrishna mission, founded by Vivekananda in the 1918 or 17, something like that. He came here. So I went down there and made the arrangements. We went down there. We went to Swami Prabhavananda's office, myself and some devotees, and we walk in, and this Swami is a gentleman wearing a business suit and neighbor jacket like that. Looked like a businessman. And they had a conversation, and you could see right away that there was a very strong, challenging mood. We didn't understand what was going on, but our feeling was it wasn't very enlivening. We were not enthused by the conversation. Prabhupada was all aglow. He was saying, "Oh, Chaitanya," and this man was saying, "No, no, Swami, Chaitanya, no, 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 no." So, you know, so on the way back in the car, we were very quiet. You know, there wasn't very much enthusiasm. We were just chanting. Everything was quiet. And then Prabhupada said, "You know, this Vedanta Society was introduced in America by Swami Vivekananda, who was preaching about Ramakrishna." He said, "Ramakrishna was not very popular in India, but Swami Vivekananda, he came here. He was a very intellectual type, wearing a turban, and he spoke and he told everybody how great Ramakrishna was. And he attracted very scholarly, a lot of elderly people and so forth to get money, and he became famous. Then he went back to India, so anything that became famous in America, then the Indians would follow. So he became famous that way. But in India, Prabhupada said he wasn't really much of anything, you know. He's just a concoction, really." And then he said, "You know, the Swami Vivekananda, he came here 50 years ago, and they have only now 7 centers. He didn't even say only, he said they have 7 centers. And then he just smiled and he said, "And we too have 7 centers. So everybody said, "Jai!" And Prabhupada just lifted us up and made us understand how much this movement has power and is growing, you see. Which was always the way he did things like that. I just read a letter that Prabhupada had written from here to Janardhan in Montreal, where he said, just the other day we went to see Swami Prabhavananda of the Vedanta Society, And Swami Vivekananda has preached that Ramakrishna is an incarnation of Lord Chaitanya. In his last life, he was Lord Chaitanya, something like that, you see. And he said, just see what kind of philosophy this is, that how could Krishna was preaching one thing and now he's preaching something else, you see? You know? In other words, you understand. So this is why this so-called Swami was getting very upset, because Prabhupada was saying these kind of things to him, you see. So we understood. I was thinking at the time, due to my immaturity, that he was arguing about placing our books in their stores, but I understand they're all impersonalists. They would never put our books there. I had no idea what was going on.
And another time in Dallas, he was visiting the Dallas Gurukula. This was, I'm definitely a demon. I just have this demoniac heart. And we had this kirtan in Dallas, and Prabhupada was there, Vishnu Janand Swami was there, Jatirtha was there, a lot of big devotees were there. And it was one of the most ecstatic kirtans I've ever experienced. Everybody was 5 feet off the ground. Jatirtha was flying in the air, twirling on the way down, and Prabhupada was, and there were waves of devotees were just running back and forth. And Srila Prabhupada he was always in ecstasy, but you could see there was this great feeling permeating the entire Dallas room. And I had this demoniac thought. The mind is just amazing. And I thought, everybody loves Prabhupada. Everybody's worshiping Prabhupada. I want to see if he's really transcendental. So it was palpable, the affection and love and the honor that everybody was giving to Srila Prabhupada. So I thought, I want to see what he does. So after the kirtan was over and everybody was paying obeisances, I stood up or sat up and just looked at him. I wanted to see what expression was on his face. Was he like gloating because everybody was worshiping him, or I wanted to see what kind of expression he had. And he was glancing over to that side of the room, and he glanced over and he saw me. And for a fraction of a second, it was just like disbelief or shock that I could be so gross and fallen, I guess. And then it was like that. He immediately was just totally transcendental and not bothered by it. And I could just see that he was embarrassed for me and that he was totally transcendental. It was such a great lesson for my stone heart to see that he was totally in control all the time, humble servant of Krishna.
Also on that occasion, Prabhupada said, this balcony system is very nice. So this balcony system is very nice. He said, and if possible, there should be separate entrances also for the men and the ladies.
Well, he had a lot of Bengali proverbs and sayings, practical things like, if you can make $12 running around, you can make $13 sitting down. He told me once, I was the treasurer for the BBT and the Mayapur Vrindavan Trust, and he told me, he said, the treasurer never reveals how much is in the treasury room. Because as soon as you tell, and he was meaning to the devotees in general, he says, as soon as you reveal how much is there, then everybody will want to plunder it. So I was always tight-lipped. And I told Prabhupada once, I'm always exhorting the devotees to pay the bills and send more money, and I'm always using it as a tactic that, it's an emergency, we got to pay this bill, and sometimes that was the case, but a lot of times there was money in the account. I was just trying to keep the money coming. And Prabhupada said, yes, this is correct. He wasn't authorizing me to be deceptive, overtly deceptive, but discretion, and you have to be practical. Don't get carried away on ideological absolutes of, how do you say, honesty. Not dishonesty, but, everything in the world has to be done practically and with an eye to the time and the place. And in that way, it was a lot. I got a lot of what one of the early reviewers of that first Gita that first Macmillan Gita. I don't know if it was Ginsburg, but one of the early reviewers said that Prabhupada was full of Hindu granny wisdom. I remember that quote, and that's what I got a lot of practical Hindu granny wisdom, you know. Because we came out of Amelu, the hippie, we were idealistic, and we certainly had presumptions of being philosophically sophisticated, which we weren't really at all. But most of us had a real lack of just practical, down-to-earth sense about how to do anything, you know, in an organized or systematic way. I mean, we were hippies and still, you know, detoxing off all the drugs we had been taking, hallucinogens and so forth. So there was, you know, we were spaced out and really incompetent, more or less, when it came to practical matters. And that's kind of what most of Prabhupada's input to me was about.
We took a walk with Srila Prabhupada on the pier at Venice Beach, and it was, you know, just before sunrise. The sun was coming up, and there was a woman at the end of the pier fishing, and as we came closer, she got up and she said, "Oh, Swami," and she clasped her hands. She said, "Oh, Swami, I saw you the other night on the Les Crane show. It's so nice to meet you, you know." And she was fishing, and that's all she said. And afterwards, Prabhupada said, just the fact that she gave respect to a saintly person, she will advance so much, you see. One time we were riding on the freeway, I don't recall where we were going, but there was a sign here in LA that said Santa Cruz, a certain amount of miles, you know. And Prabhupada said, "What is this Santa Cruz?" So I told him, you know, my literal understanding of the translation in Spanish. It's a name for Lord Jesus. It means Saint of the Cross, you know, just literally. He said, "Ah, yes, in India there is a place called Santa Cruz also that was founded by some missionaries," he said. It comes from the word Shanta, which means saintly, he said. "You can call me Shanta Bhaktivedanta." They seem so simple, but I'm visualizing Prabhupada, you know, and it's just so ecstatic, you know, to realize how he cultivated us in such simple little things, you know. And yet he was implanting this, this knowledge, this devotion of love that we gradually felt for him, which just completely changed our life, you know. And so we're so grateful.
And I think the other quality, which I really admired in Prabhupada, was his ability when he was preaching to be able to comprehend where the person was that he was speaking to, so that he could speak to that person directly from where that person was at, where that person's philosophical understanding was, where that person's self-realization was, exactly what platform he was on. And it was as if he would come directly inside of the other person and then convince them, step by step, that Krishna was real, that, you know, just as he did it in my life, but I think with everyone, you know, he just was able to see, and I pray for that ability somehow, to even a small part of that ability, to be able to not be threatened at all by where the other person is, and to somehow open their heart a little bit to be able to see Krishna and accept Krishna consciousness, the way that Prabhupada was so expert at doing, and still doing.
And then another time, Prabhupada at that time was trying to acquire a permanent visa. I don't know all the intricacies of the situation, but I know he had to see a doctor to get a doctor's health statement for whether it was a permanent one or a temporary one. And I had a friend who had a doctor, he recommended a doctor for me in Pasadena. It was La Crescenta. So we were driving Prabhupada to the doctor. I believe Subal was driving the car, and I think Gorsunda was there. I'm not quite sure. I might not have even been there, but I know the story, but I think I was. It's a little vague. And because this was a hippie car, it was an old Volkswagen that some hippie had donated, who was favorable to the movement, but it had all these huge, colorful flowers painted on it, big, big daisies, like, you know, in different colors. So you could see it a mile away. So naturally, some policemen stopped us just for the fact that he knew something had to be wrong with it, just by the way it looked. So Subal had an outstanding number of traffic violations, and they immediately took him away. Papa was there in the middle of the freeway. But of course, Subal, I think Gosunda was there, so he drove. But Prabhupada said, Krishna is telling us that we need a better car, you see. So that's a small little sideline.
One time I went on a morning walk with him when Koshaya and Madhavananda, they were the temple, he was the temple president in Detroit, and I was there with them. And then there were some problems, or Prabhupada wanted Govardhan to be president there again. So we went to New York, and I joined them in New York. And we went on a morning walk with Prabhupada. And of course, as women, we weren't able to walk up close to Prabhupada. But I remember on this one morning walk, I just thought this was so wonderful. We were walking on the pavement, and Prabhupada stopped, everybody stopped, and looked down at the crack on the pavement and said, "Look at this plant. The living entity is so powerful that it's pushing through the cement." He was just making a example of how the Atma is so strong that it can actually crack through the cement.
They couldn't get Nair to do the final things, to give them the title, and then so everybody there, all the devotees there had tried, and Prabhupada had called me, asked me to come and see if I could help out. I don't, a babe in the woods landing in India, dealing with, the levels of sophistication of manipulation and deception there are just light years ahead of what usually exists in the West. So I went there, and I just, I didn't do any good. I was kind of puffed up. I arrived there thinking, well, now the American management know-how is going to set everything straight, And I didn't have any idea what I was going to find in India. So I spent about 2 weeks there and realized there was a morass that I didn't have the slightest notion of how to deal with it. I went and saw Mr. Nair, and it was completely naive on my part. I remember trying to make a phone call there at that little office at the Juhuland Gandhigram, and spending 3 or 4 hours trying to make a phone call to downtown Bombay and saying, "My God, I just want to get out of here. This is a nightmare." So in fact, I kind of copped out because I was only there for a couple of weeks, and I think Prabhupada wanted me to stay longer, but I said, I got to get back. I got these problems with Dinapan, and I got to do this and do that, so please let me go. So he said, okay, go ahead. So I went back, just trying to escape the difficult problems there that I didn't. By that time, I'd become accustomed. I was like the wonder boy of business within the group. Prabhupada had praised me several times in letters, a good manager, this and that. So I'd kind of started to believe it, and that was a good lesson. That it was really the father figure encouraging the immature child just to keep them motivated.
Now, also at that particular time when Prabhupada first arrived, I got a call from New York City from Life magazine. They were doing an article on the Swami circuit, they called it, because there was a beginning interest in these different groups of Swamis, impersonal Swamis, and so forth and so on. They had gone to our 26 Second Avenue temple, but Prabhupada was in LA, they told him, so they called me. A freelance photographer called and said that, and reported that they wanted to see the Swami. So I arranged it with Srila Prabhupada. They came to the temple, and they made it look a little nicer than it was by putting up some things. And I was sitting there while they interviewed Prabhupada. The reporter was there, and it was a woman reporter, Mataji, and a freelance photographer. And they asked Prabhupada some questions, but basically first he described the mission he was on, and they didn't write any of those things down. I was watching, which was very typical of the reporters in those days. Whenever Prabhupada spoke philosophy, they would gloss over, flip the page, not write it, but they wanted to know why we were wearing tilak and what was the bead bag and all that stuff, And so I didn't realize. I thought I was a little confused because I didn't know these things and that they would be like that. So I was anxious to see the article. There was not a word of what Prabhupada said in the article, but they did say, of all the groups that they mentioned, you can't get this Hare Krishna mantra out of your head. And they did mention something that Prabhupada said, that Lord Krishna, the Swami said Lord Krishna descended at such and such a time to this planet. And so the fact that he mentioned Lord Krishna, Prabhupada said, was wonderful. But what he did say really was that anybody who sees these pictures, who's sincere, will benefit from the pictures. He said, that is all right, they will see the pictures. And they had this wonderful picture of Prabhupada. But it was done with filters to make it more attractive. So that was very nice.
I guess I really desired to actually be his personal servant a lot, like Govinda Dasi and Gaurasundar, or whoever. And then in the very old days, Grihastha couples were allowed to do that. So I think we both sort of desired that we had that, would have that ability. So perhaps that's why I was given Tulsi's service, because although I couldn't serve Prabhupada, I could serve her. So that really helped me a lot to have that personal service. So, but this time Prabhupada was in LA, always in the back. They had promised that whoever worked 13 hours, did service 13 hours a day, could take his personal darshan, or at least go on a morning walk. And of course, I sort of didn't belong to any particular club or, like department, so I didn't get to do any of those things. So we were waiting for Prabhupada to come out after class. I guess he was going on his morning walk, and we were standing outside the door way in the back because we were new devotees and unimportant and so many things, and we were sort of scuffling around, feeling sorry for ourselves that we'd come so late to the movement to not really be able to be with Prabhupada very much. So he gets in his car, and in LA there's a sort of this sidewalk that comes up, and the car is down lower than the sidewalk. So Prabhupada got in the car, and the car was coming out. And previous to that, we were in the back, but somehow, as the car came out of this little driveway, we ended up being right at the edge of the driveway. And I don't even know how we got there, because there were so many devotees waiting for him. But somehow we were right on the edge, and as we looked out, Srila Prabhupada was looking right at us. But we didn't, all I could see were these red orbs like suns just piercing through me. And then in my heart, and also my husband's heart, we felt as if he said, "So, what do you want to say? What do you want?" And we both instantly reeled back from that sidewalk, way back toward the sign, that was in the middle. We found ourselves both back there, sort of going like this, from this obviously we weren't ready for his association. But anyway, they were just like suns that pierced into our hearts and cleansed us, and our minds as well.
Prabhupada, let's see, he said, I remember he told me once that mung dal should always have a little bit of ghee in it, because otherwise it creates problems with the eyes. I don't know. I don't even remember how that came up, but I remember him telling me that mung dal always has to have ghee for the eyes. Devotees should eat simply. I remember asking him sometimes in LA about the diet. There was ghee should come from unsalted butter, but then we had a chance of getting this surplus butter from the government that was salted. And he said, "Oh yeah, okay, get it and make it into ghee. It can be used. It's not ideal."
In San Francisco, we went on many walks with Srila Prabhupada. One of his favorite places was Stowe Lake, which is a beautiful lake in the middle of Golden Gate Park. And actually, Prabhupada called it a garden because it's architecturally landscaped. It isn't natural like Griffith Park in Los Angeles. And Stowe Lake is a beautiful lake, and we'd walk there with Prabhupada. In the morning, there would be the same woman that would come all the time with her dog, and Prabhupada would always just say, "Hello, good morning, how are you?" You see, and she'd just smile. He never said Hare Krishna. So one morning, one of the disciples that were there, I forget who it was, one of my godbrothers, asked Prabhupada why. He said, "Swamiji, why do you not say Hare Krishna to her?" He said, "Probably," he said, "she would not say Hare Krishna back. And this way she gets the benefit of giving respect to a saintly person." It's the same kind of thing as in Venice.
And another time we were in Hyderabad, at the Hyderabad farm, and we got left behind. All the devotees went on ahead, and Palika, and I think Ashaya was there. We went swimming, and we got left behind, and Prabhupada was just so relaxed. There's pictures of him there at the farm. He's leaning up against the tree, and he was just so happy, and he was asking us, did we have enough prasadam? Did we have enough saris? Were we comfortable? Was everything okay? How come we were there? And so we had to say that we got left behind, and he arranged specifically for a lorry truck to come and bring us back to Hyderabad. And he was just very caring and loving. And I guess there's other things that my memory could come up with, but I think that's what I can remember now.
The second letter that you wrote, I guess in Dallas, did you say, "I'm sorry for not paying obeisance," or was that part of that?
No, in Dallas I wrote to him because at that time there had been introduced the whole concept in Sankirtan, which really was full bloom a few years later, and they were there was a big heavy pressure for women to be chaste, humble, shy, and submissive. And then at the same time, boom, at 9 o'clock, out the door you went, and the Sankirtan quote-unquote leader had you in pants, you know, standing on an island in the middle of a highway. And I said to Srila Prabhupada, you know, I want to be chaste, shy, and submissive, but this is what we're doing during the day. By the way, do you know this? You know. And he wrote back that letter, which I've seen quoted now several times. I wrote it on behalf of myself, and there was our Sankirtan party. There was about 10 women, and this was bothering us. And he wrote back a wonderful letter, and the gist of the letter was, aggression for the cause of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu will purify you of all your desires for sense gratification, which I didn't think I was asking about my desire for sense gratification, but he's obviously that's what he was telling us, to just go on being aggressive, that aggression for the cause of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's preaching is purifying. And that was really what we were all just trying to get purified. You know, we were just thinking we were the victims, but actually we were all just in the process of purification.
Govinda Dasya told me that the Swamiji prefers to be called Srila Prabhupada. See, I wasn't around when they had this discussion, you know, about how this would come about. So I heard it through Govinda Dasi, and it was a little disturbing to me because I was attached to that name. So on this morning walk with Srila Prabhupada, I went up to him and I said, Swamiji, I understand that you prefer to be called Prabhupada. And he said, where did you hear this? Who told you this? And then his mood changed. He said, actually, I do not prefer, but it is better. Hare Krishna.
In Dallas, when I was head of the Gurukula in Dallas, and we hadn't been in the building very long, but this one afternoon, this incredible storm came upon the school. In the middle of the day, it turned dark as night, and the wind started howling, and the wind was blowing really hard. After about 15 minutes, it blew away, and we went into this internal courtyard of the school, and this huge tree that was there had actually been blown to where it was leaning against one of the buildings where we took the shot. And you know, those days we were young, but we had fairly large responsibilities. And I felt myself capable of making a decision. I brought someone out to check the tree, a professional, and he told me that the roots were not in very good shape and the tree needed to be cut down. So I immediately contracted to have the tree cut down. Several weeks later, Srila Prabhupada arrived, and the story was related to him, and he immediately wanted to know which fool had made this decision. And so I immediately came forward and took my instructions. And what I learned, not then, but later, was that Prabhupada was the consummate business person. And you know, what my chore should have been was to have gotten 2 or 3 different quotes and found the truth, rather than just proceed as I did. So,
Srila Prabhupada had to struggle very hard to build the Jukan temple. The first struggle was to get the land, and the next struggle was to get the permission to build the temple. And the last struggle was to actually build the temple and install the deities. And we had worked very hard to get the permission, and the Indian permissions have many conditions to them. So they give you permission, but they don't really give you permission until you fulfill the conditions. So one of the conditions was that we had to have an access road of a certain width according to how long the road was going to be. And it just so happened that that right where the access road was supposed to go, there were some palm trees. And once when Srila Prabhupada came to Juhu after being away for some time, he noticed that one or two of the palm trees had been cut down. And he was very concerned, I would say upset. And he asked, why did you cut down the trees? And we thought we had the best answer, because we had to build the temple, to get the permission to build the temple. And Srila Prabhupada said, no. You go to the municipality and tell them it is against our religion to cut down trees. So we had no choice. And we did it, and of course they argued. But one thing that really struck me about how concerned Srila Prabhupada was for the trees was the next time he came back to Juhu after a world tour, he stopped in Tehran, I think just before he returned to India. And practically the first thing he said was, I was in Tehran, and I have seen, they have trees right in the middle of the streets there. So, we can also have trees in the middle of our street. It's not so strange. And in the end, we sort of, held our ground on Srila Prabhupada's order. And in the end, they gave us the permission. And we can see that tree that Srila Prabhupada protected is still standing there with all the asphalt around it. So I'm just thinking, if Srila Prabhupada has so much care and concern, and even love, I would say, for a tree, then what to speak of us? And it's just because of Srila Prabhupada's care and mercy and protection that we are able to stand in Krishna consciousness, no matter what else is around us.
Srila Prabhupada used to use eucalyptus twigs to clean his teeth. And we had to have a certain size. It had to be about the size of this finger, a little longer, and a little green, not too green, just on the verge, and about maybe that long. And then we would cut them down, and then he would soak them overnight in water, and then bite them between his teeth, the tips, and then use the bristles as a toothbrush. So we took turns in getting these for Prabhupada. Here in Los Angeles, there were a lot of eucalyptus trees. I don't know if they still are, but they certainly were in those days. And I would go to MacArthur Park, which is on Wilshire Boulevard. I don't know if it's still there. And just about sunrise, and I would wear my hat. I don't think I had shaved up then. Maybe we were shaved up. And I had my bead bag and a huge knife. I'd never been there before. The devotees told me that's where they got them because it was quiet in the morning, nobody was there, So I parked my car just about the time that the sun came up, and I would cut down a large branch with a lot of tributaries just to pick out the right size, And I'm sitting there on this bench with this knife cutting these trees, and all of a sudden the patrol car pulls up. They're coming through the park checking at certain hours. And this policeman comes up to me, typically, kind of strutting like, kind of arrogant like, and he just comes up to me and he says, well, what do you have there, young man? And I told him, I said, I'm cutting these down for my spiritual master. He uses these as toothbrush. And he said to me, have I been in a mental institution? What do you have in that bag there? And I explained that to him. He said, I can arrest you, for carrying that weapon in your hand. But he saw that he was just using his power. And he said, okay, So I told this to Srila Prabhupada, and he said, well, did you ask him if he was crazy? So I took it as Prabhupada teaching me to be bold,
Another time on a morning walk, Prabhupada said that these days I am not eating. He said, no, I'm not eating. He said, but I am working. He said, so you are saving money.
So we had very easy access to Srila Prabhupada in those days. sometimes, you know, I was a little older than most of the devotees. I was 27, and I'd get an anxiety about things. They would take my things or whatever. So I'd go to see Srila Prabhupada, and many of my godbrothers experienced this in Prabhupada's presence. We'd be in such anxiety about this and that, and as soon as we came into Prabhupada's room, we understood right away that we should just chant Hare Krishna and everything would disappear. So we couldn't even approach Prabhupada with these questions. So one time I had the good fortune to be in there, or as Prabhupada would say, I created your good fortune, you know, which is actually the truth, you know. It was Prabhupada who created this good fortune for us to be there. I remember I was there, and I don't remember the actual reason I went to see him. It might have been one of those times when I was anxiety. So I just sat down and chanted, you see. It was a large room. It was just myself and Srila Prabhupada. He was sitting over there, and I was sitting here. And he said to me, and I sat on the floor, and he said to me, take a pillow because sitting on the floor creates hemorrhoids. Just like that. Everything's so practical, you see. And then I started to chant, and I was very engrossed in my chanting. And I closed my eyes, which is common for me to do, and then all of a sudden it dawned on me that maybe I was taking up too much of Srila Prabhupada's time. So I opened up my eyes and I said, I should go, Srila Prabhupada. And he said, no, no, that is all right, you can stay. So I asked him, it might have been another time, or it might have been this time, but I asked him, I said, is it really true, Srila Prabhupada, that we can speak and talk to Krishna just like I'm speaking and seeing you, talking to you? And he looked at me and he said, yes. And that's all that I needed to know, you see. It's very clear that, just like that, a matter of fact, absolutely. So that was a wonderful experience. We all had our doubts, you know, we were practicing, but still, you know, we weren't fully knowledgeable of this, even to this day, you know, so certainly that was a wonderful thing. It was very reassuring.
Prabhupada tended to be, at least when there was a specific context, a specific person being asked about it, being, I think I remember we had the tendency as the devotees of being a little more rigid and inflexible and doctrinaire about diet and how many hours you would sleep and all this. And it would create sometimes dilemmas in the group dynamics if somebody was sick on an extended basis and couldn't come to Mangal Artik and had to have special food, and it kind of upset things, you know. Well, everybody else has to eat this and everybody else has to get up, and you know, it was kind of this sense. And I probably was a big part of trying to maintain the military rigidity and, you know, follow the program or go somewhere else. And he was always a little more flexible, you know. Okay, if they can't eat this, give them that, this, that. I remember some comments, well, things like Prabhupada said, if you're hungry, if a person's really hungry, they can eat anything. But that, you know, rice, dal, chapatis and this type of regimen was the best overall. But if somebody needed steamed vegetables or this or that, okay, arrange for it somehow. Health-wise, whatever. So I remember Prabhupada said once that a young child cannot eat too much and an older man cannot eat too little. I remember that bit. A little bit of granny wisdom. Western medicines and doctors, yes. Of course, we were trying to follow the Eastern tradition. There wasn't much known about Ayurveda. Prabhupada, in those early days, there wasn't much talk about that. Before some devotees had gone to India and discovered, you know, the herbal formulas, and there wasn't any dissemination about Ayurveda in the West at that time that I know of. Not even Chinese, traditional Chinese medicine, practically nothing was known. There was the old macrobiotic thing, you know, should we eat brown rice? And Prabhupada said, no, not generally, because we should eat what Krishna wants. Because there were some devotees, I think Nandu Kumar, who was Prabhupada's servant, was sometimes asking Prabhupada, well, shouldn't we eat raw sugar and macrobiotic rice and this and that? And Prabhupada said, no, we should eat what Krishna, we offer to Krishna.
Srila Prabhupada said, he told a story which probably most of you have heard. He said, suppose some man is walking down the street and he sees some stick He says, is it worth anything? No, Prabhupada, it's not worth anything. And he's walking and he sees some wire. Is it a very valuable thing? No, Prabhupada. And he's walking and he sees some gourd. Is it a very valuable thing? So Prabhupada said, yes, but an intelligent man, he fixes the stick on the gourd and attaches the wire and he makes a musical instrument. He said, similarly, I have picked up all you American and European boys and girls.
So we had this wonderful Rath Yatra in San Francisco, and I had such an ecstatic experience. And so I wrote Prabhupada a letter about, what I was feeling, and his answer was that yes, Krishna consciousness is experienced like electric energy. He said the atheistic people may say that after all this was just a festival and there was a cart made out of wood, but they don't understand that the Krishna consciousness energy can be experienced through any element. It's all just Krishna's energies, he said. So now you have to spread this electric Krishna consciousness energy through your country, that there are many, many festivals like Rath Yatra, not just this one, but Krishna has multi-pastimious activities. You can gradually introduce them little by little into your center, he said. So now you can experience what the masses in large can feel, you say, that you're experiencing just a small percentage of this amount. So that was a very enlivening letter.
So in 1969, most of you know that the temple wasn't located here, but it was located over on La Cienega Boulevard. And there was a very significant occurrence at that time. There was no, well, there had been a Vyasasan. Narayana had built a Vyasasan in San Francisco. Tamal Krishna Maharaj wanted one for Los Angeles as well. So Narayana had built a Vyasasan to offer to Srila Prabhupada. And when he accepted the Vyasasan, he had tears in his eyes. And he declared before all the devotees, he said, I am not fit, but on behalf of my Guru Maharaj, I must accept. Of course, we can understand. Mahabhagavat, pure devotee, is always fit to receive that level of honor. But in his heart, that humility he was showing from his heart, not artificial, but from his heart, showing that humility, that he felt, truly this should be offered to my Guru Maharaj, to Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. I should not be taking for myself. I will not take for myself, but I will offer this on his behalf. As his representative, I will accept, only on those terms, like that. So, because he knew that that first Vyasasan with the wooden railing, gold-leafed railing around it, Narayana had designed that Vyasasan after an old black and white photograph of the throne of the king of Jaipur. So Srila Prabhupada, being well educated, must have known exactly where that design came from, because it was an exact replica of the throne of the king of Jaipur. So Prabhupada probably knew that, because he said, this is meant for kings. So he accepted that with great humility. Then on his, it was either the appearance or Disciplines Day of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, Prabhupada would not sit on the Vyasasan. He sat on a cushion on the floor, and he put the painting or photograph of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, he put on the Vyasasan. He would not sit on that day on the Vyasasan. He sat on the floor to honor his Guru Maharaj. So that is the proper etiquette.
So also going back to San Francisco, when I was there at the time, there's a devotee here in Los Angeles now. At that time he was in San Francisco. And it's all right to mention his name because this story has been circulated. And his name is Makhan Lal, and his brother's name is Narayan. And they were very sincere devotees. They came in the early days of San Francisco. And Prabhupada said that they were very nice, but a little eccentric. See, so Makhan Lal, I told him this the other day, and he said, it is all right because it's already been said, you know. And he's not like that so much anymore, you know. But they were very sincere. And they were hippies, they had very long hair and wore very typical clothes of those days. Somewhat, to me, it was the impression of them was they were a bit Shakespearean when they spoke, you know. Hare Krishna, like that, you see. Mukund Lal still has that. So it used to irritate me terribly when Mukund Lal would chant, he'd say, Hare Krishna, 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 Hare Hare, like that. And I would get very disturbed during the kirtans. So we had arranged this engagement that Mukund Lal did in the YWCA in Berkeley. And we went along in the car with Srila Prabhupada. I drove him and drove him back. I believe Mukund Lal was in the car going but not coming back. And we get there and it was very nice, and all of a sudden, who's leading the kirtan but Mukund Lal? So I must have shown very obviously my distaste. I think I might have even gotten out of the room, as a matter of fact. He was not very tolerant and didn't understand the right thing. So driving Prabhupada home in the car, and we're driving alone, and he looks at me and he said, Aniruddha, this Mukund Lal, he sings very nicely, don't you think? So I had to say, Jai, Prabhupada. But then I understood, you know, gradually, now that Trinad api sunichena tarapi sahishnuna amanina manadena kirtaniya sadari. In that mode, you can preach and chant incessantly, and Prabhupada knew exactly how to see everybody and utilize their service, even though there were some qualities that were not very nice. He never found fault, he only found the good. And he always used to say to us, it's very easy to be critical, but to find the good is rare, you see. And that was not my quality, but I'm beginning to understand that when I reflect on these things now. How magnificently, that is the real way to preach. You know, that is the real way to not disturb anybody. And Prabhupada was a perfect Vaishnava. And one of the qualities of a Vaishnava is that he's a perfect gentleman, a pure Vaishnava. And he doesn't disturb anybody's mind. And he's able to just see that and take it out. That's why we all wanted to serve him. See, why we have difficulty with some people who don't have that quality. It's very rare to achieve that in fullness. But we can achieve it if we understand that by that example.
I had a question that I'd been thinking about for actually probably since 1968 in different ways. And finally, we were on this walk, well, again, big men, sannyasis and GBC men, and I was there. So I asked Srila Prabhupada, screwed up my courage and asked Srila Prabhupada, that sometimes we see that the spiritual master makes, sometimes from the mundane point of view, we see that the spiritual master makes mistakes. And Prabhupada said, that is mundane point of view. And I said, well, even sometimes we see that in spiritual matters, the spiritual master, he may quote a verse wrong, or he may not remember a verse. So, of course, I was pushing it, because so many times we've heard Srila Prabhupada say, what is that verse? Or quote a verse not exactly as it is in the text. So I said, sometimes we see, and then so Prabhupada said, again, that is mundane point of view. So just like Srila Gorkishore Das Babaji Maharaj, he could not even write his own name. But he was accepted as spiritual master by Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur, who was the greatest scholar. So we have to see, not from the superficial point of view, but how the spiritual master is preaching and how he's fully engaged in the service of Krishna. And that we have to see. He explained a little bit more about that. It's recorded. So after the walk, the several GBC men and sannyasis jumped on me. You have a lot of nerve, and how could you ask Srila Prabhupada that kind of question? Who do you think you are? And that was offensive. So I was a little concerned. And later on in the morning, after the class, I went up to Srila Prabhupada's room in the Lotus building in Mayapur. And Srila Prabhupada perhaps was just finishing his breakfast. He was just there. I came in and offered obeisances. I said, Srila Prabhupada, yes. That question that I asked this morning, I said, what is that? I recapped the question. I said, Srila Prabhupada, was that question offensive? Prabhupada said, not offensive. Just ignorant.
Going back to La Cienega Temple, there's a nice story in relationship to Vishnu Jana Swami. He since has left his body, and he was a wonderful devotee, and he sang beautifully. Prabhupada used to say by his singing alone he can go back to the spiritual world. But he was very expert in instruments. He liked to play elaborately on the harmonium and play the tambura, and he made up his own melodies quite a bit, you know. So he was a little bit embarrassed to go in front of Prabhupada with his own melodies, but he wanted to be recognized. So in the La Cienega Temple, Prabhupada had a room that he used adjoining the main temple room just while he was coming there, not to stay, just to stay for some privacy. You can go in from the front of the temple and also go into the temple room. So Vishnu Jana would sit outside in the temple room, and he would play these melodies in front of Prabhupada with the harmonium very elaborately. And Prabhupada came out and said, "What is wrong with the melodies I have given you?" I say that in context to today, since the movement has grown so much and we have so many different melodies, you know, but I'm so fond of the original melodies. Although, you know, Prabhupada was very broad-minded also. He knew that we were attracting all kinds of varieties of people. But he did say in those days, very specifically, when Vishnu Jana Maharaj started to have these road companies and they would play with guitars and a lot of music, he'd say, this is very good to attract people coming on the periphery, but the devotees shouldn't get that attached to it, you see. But it's very common now to some places for them to play all these songs very commonly, you know. So whatever brings them into Krishna consciousness is all right, because Prabhupada taught us to be broad-minded. We have to be careful not to go too far, compromise too much.
I remember one devotee got very upset. It was up in Prabhupada's room one day. I think it had to do with the breakfast cereal, which was always very sweet. It was a mush usually, oatmeal or something. And it was always usually pretty sweet because that's, you know, we all had sweet tooth, really. And at one point the devotee, I don't know what was the discussion was going on, but he said, "Oh, I remember, it was Rishabdev. No, not Laguna Beach Rishabdev. No, it wasn't Rishabdev. I know I can see the face, but I can't remember the name." He said, "Prabhupada, we eat too much sugar." And Prabhupada just looked at him and said, "Well, why do you eat so much sugar?" So in that sense, you know, it's like, you know, if you've got these compulsions, you know, you should work on them yourself, not necessarily. Although I have to say, institutionally, it was true. You know, if you were living in the temple, you had to eat what the temple served, and a lot of time the temple food was, you know, probably not the most healthy or the best prepared.
Then I had been in Hawaii for a number of years. I came there in 1973, and Ambarish Prabhu had bought this beautiful home for Srila Prabhupada that he wanted to have for him to translate without being disturbed. You know, and so Prabhupada came to Hawaii. First he came to, the time before that, he came to a temple in Moana Loa Valley on a street called Ala Aloha Loop. It's a little bit out of the main part of town, you know, in a residential area, very difficult to get to, you know. Nobody could come by very easily. It was just a place we found, you know. There was a few temples there, but this was the second one. Govinda Dasi and Giriraj had started that temple. And then this was the next one that Sudama at the time was a Maharaj, was in charge of. And Prabhupada came there. I remember he came there because I was there at that time. He cooked the feast even, and it was just unbelievable. And then I remember specifically we were having Guru Puj. And this has never left me all these years. We were chanting Shri Guru Charana Padma, and I opened my eyes and looked, and Prabhupada is saying, we should enter into the meaning of this, you see. I didn't quite grasp what that meant, but that has stayed with me all these years, you know. And it really is very, very deep meaning. I'm beginning to just get a little flash of that, you know, that this is very important, that when you really mean that you want to be serious to follow Srila Prabhupada, really mean it, you know, then I'm finding that the process is just really beginning for me with that attitude for the first time. And entering into the meaning really means to understand what Prabhupada is really doing. I don't know if you want to put this on the tape or not, you know. But understanding what it really means, that Prabhupada is telling us all these things, but they're having the real meaning of it, that the spiritual master is, his lotus feet are the only way that you can achieve pure devotional service. And you have to be burning with that desire. Prabhupada used to say in all his lectures, you have to be very anxious for this and develop this, you know. But we heard it, but we couldn't quite understand what that really meant, you know. So this is not so easy, but when you change your heart and you really become serious, then you can enter into the meaning of these things and feel it with great emotion, you know, and really feel a great reciprocation with Srila Prabhupada. It comes from changing, really meaning what you say. I'm going to follow you strictly. Sometimes we say, I'll try, you see, because we're not always ready to do that in our life. We have a lot of things, you know. It takes a while. Everybody has a different way to go, you know. Everybody goes at a certain pace, you know. But sooner or later, you know, that's the goal. So if you can achieve that, it's very nice, Prabhupada would like that, you know. So that's very important.
Yeah, I remember he came to LA because as I recall, he split up his group and sent some to San Francisco, some to LA, I think some went to New York. He himself came to LA. And we kind of butted heads right off the bat because, you know, I was critical. I thought, along with some others, that this was, you know, dilettante, this whole thing with his group and his people. They were nice people. A lot of them were charming and nice, sincere, but I think I was, you know, overly critical that this is, you know, this is the real movement and you guys are kind of interlopers and now you're coming to us and now you're going to have to kind of follow our program. And a couple of his closer associates wanted to protect him and put him in a special position, and I was against that. I said, no, you're going to have to just follow the program like everybody else. So there were a couple spats. I remember he went up to Prabhupada and complained about me, and Prabhupada called me up, and Prabhupada said, well, you know, be a little patient and tolerant. Let's try and work this thing out. Prabhupada said, he's a sincere boy. He's come with his people, and we have to try to make them comfortable and so forth. But my ego was too big. He left, Siddhaswarupa left. I don't know where he went after he left, but he was only in LA for a short time. I think he had to go back to some place where he could kind of find his own space and be his own president GBC, you know, which was no different than a lot of others. You know, I mean, I was like that more than anybody else. As long as I was in LA in my own domain, so to speak, I was much more comfortable. As soon as I went somewhere else where I didn't have so much control over my environment and my schedule, I didn't like it. And I wanted to get back to LA, yeah.
I would stay back, and one particular morning, I was sitting on the steps going up to the second floor, which led to Prabhupada's apartment, and some devotee had stayed back to guard Prabhupada's quarters. And I was talking to him, telling him probably some stories about Prabhupada. And just when I turned around, there was Prabhupada coming up the stairs, you see. So I had to offer my respects, of course. And he said, oh, Aniruddha, how are you? Just so general questions, you know. So I had to be honest. I couldn't say I'm fine, you know. So I said, how can I be, Prabhupada? I'm not living in the temple. So he looked at me very seriously. He got very grave. He said, so? That's all he had to say, you know. He understood exactly what he meant. You're speaking like this, but why you're not acting this way? Hare Krishna. And he went upstairs. So when Prabhupada was leaving, we all went to the airport to see him off. And in Hawaii airport at that time, the gate was separated from the main thoroughfare of the terminal with just a glass partition. You know, there was an entry, but they had some glass you can look through. So I was staying on the outside of the glass partition. Everybody went inside and was sitting around Prabhupada, you know, and I was staying away, you know. But I wanted to, you know, but at the same time I was listening to my mind. So Bhumya came to the gate, to the glass, and said to me, he said, Prabhupada wants to see you. So again, my heart started to really pound, you know, boom, 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 boom. And so I went inside and very shyly, he had Sudama get up and have me sit next to him. I later on learned that Satsarup Maharaj Goswami, who was traveling with Prabhupada, had mentioned, oh, there's Aniruddha, Prabhupada, you remember him? He said, yes, tell him to come in. So I sat next to him, and he just looked at me and he said, oh, how have you been? You've been with your father? Something like general. So, immediately the mind is thinking, well, why is he asking me about that, But I understand now that Prabhupada was revealing to me that he knew that most of my problems dealt from the fact that I had a very bad relationship with my father as a karmi, and that that's one of the reasons I couldn't relate to anybody, and why I couldn't speak, why I was so shy, And so I really lament now, because what I was feeling was that I wanted to say, no, Prabhupada, you are my father, you see. But I couldn't say that, so I said, no, Srila Prabhupada, ever since I have had anything to do with Krishna consciousness, my parents don't want to have anything to do with me. And we both just smiled. Prabhupada's face just lit up, and I came alive, I was so morose, all that before, but my whole life came back to me again at that moment. My spiritual life, I felt so enlivened. I realized how morose I was, and it was just a very wonderful experience. Then he turned to everybody and said, in LA, because the devotees were in awe, thinking that I was having this communication with Prabhupada. And they were transcendently envious, which is beautiful, He said, we all want to have some association with Prabhupada. But I was oblivious that I was just focusing on Srila Prabhupada and him and me, but we were the only ones there. But when I turned around, I noticed that they were looking that way. And he said, in LA, Aniruddha was the beginning, you see. So right away, I felt very ashamed of myself. I knew that it was leading up to giving me some instruction. Because I knew that Prabhupada knew my heart, and he knew how to bring us out, that I understood that I was just covered over, but that I had a certain attitude that it would get clear fairly easily, And just gross bodily gratification, I wasn't really envious of him in any way. So I felt responsible to help that temple because of that, because the temple at the time was having difficulty, and I had a lot of experience in that in LA. So that was a reminder to me that I could help in that respect, you see. And then it was announced that it was time for his plane to leave. So Prabhupada was walking to the gate, and as he's walking towards the gate, he turns around, but he doesn't look at me, but I could see from the corner of my eye that he was looking at me like that. You can just see his eyes move. He said, Aniruddha, you take charge of Sankirtan. And here was the instruction I was fearing. And I said, take charge, Prabhupada, because I wasn't even chanting my rounds or anything. And he said, yes, Hare Krishna. And he just went on the plane. So, what can you do? Of course, I'm sure Prabhupada knew that I wouldn't do it right away, But these things were there and have never left me. And whether or not he knew I wasn't going to do it then, I really believe that Prabhupada knew that this would happen, because I'm ready to do these things now. And this is the importance. These things have been going in my mind over and over for years. I've just never acted on them. So I feel very determined now to fulfill all these things that Prabhupada said. In one letter he said to me, you can do tremendous service to Krishna. But I was thinking like my father, who's just flattering me to get me to do something, you see. Prabhupada knows our potential, If we just follow everything he says, that's what I'm understanding. If we just chant and really try to hear, then automatically you become detached, you see. We get rid of this ego, and this is what's holding us back, that I'm the doer. That if you do these things, then Krishna does everything. And then it becomes very ecstatic, very enlivening, because we don't have to worry about the results. Oh, I cannot do this because we're doing it for some recognition or some ulterior motive to be, we're thinking like that, for position, whatever. So that's really freedom. And Prabhupada said that, but we couldn't really grasp it. We were attracted to Prabhupada's energy, his love, and that. The philosophy was difficult for some of us.
I wasn't a special soul. I was a spoiled, self-centered kind of a immature brat, really. And I was very, had very low self-image, very low self-esteem. And he always nurtured me in a lot of ways psychologically. So in that sense, it was a very profound and deep relationship. So for me, it did a lot to rehabilitate my damaged and kind of dysfunctional personality. But it swung to the other side, my fault. I became egotistical and puffed up, and I really began to think I knew more and I knew better. So far as Prabhupada's qualities, I would be describing qualities of like a child remembering a parent. I wouldn't try to pretend that I'm a great judge of characters or saints or anything. I really don't know who Prabhupada is or who he was. Because,
no, I don't mean that. I mean,
yeah.
just in your relation, you were saying, you said he was kind, he was nurturing.
He was very kind and nurturing, and I think that's what attracted me to him. And a lot of the I think most of the devotees in those early days, the devotees that I was involved in my formative years, Tamal Krishna, Gargamuni, Shalavati, just a few of the names I remember because they were the ones I was around. But I think the relationship was the same. We were really very childish in most ways, and Prabhupada was just a patient. He gave us a kind of attention and patience that we never got, that our parents were unable to give. It just wasn't culturally there, and the time and the history and all the circumstances that contributed. So he certainly was patient. He certainly was, a father figure. And we were certainly children who needed a lot of patience and tolerance. Yeah. Other than that, he was practical. He was sensible. He definitely was dedicated to his mission. I always thought that Prabhupada really worked. He was really alone. We were all more trouble for him than I think we helped. He was always telling us how much we helped him, but I think we were at least as much trouble, gave him as many headaches as we did any service. And he was really, he was centered that he carried on with his mission despite all of the hassles and the turmoils that we generally would provoke and generate.
Although Prabhupada did say one time to Upenja, Upenja had come back to Hawaii. I think Prabhupada was sending him to Fiji then to open up a temple. Upenja is one of the early God brothers from the early days. Just a wonderful devotee, so warm and kind and affectionate. So many devotees felt that way. And he was a young man, and Prabhupada took him under his wing in the beginning. And so he went back to LA with Prabhupada from Hawaii, and when Upenja came back, he said he was with Prabhupada in his room, and they were sitting together in a very intimate way. And Prabhupada just looked at him and said, Upenja, those were the good old days. He said, they will not be like that anymore. Yeah. So, I certainly I would not exchange that experience. Everything has its purpose.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Jai Anilo, Premadana, Karuna Prachu.
So also going back to San Francisco, when I was there at the time, there's a devotee here in Los Angeles.